So last week, we started a new series, Revolution. I said that it was going to be a little different, and that's my intent, to shake us up a little bit, to help us to think about really what church is all about, because sometimes we lose sight of that. Last week, my sermon title was God's Cosmic Rescue Operation, and my goal, as it was last week, for today is the same. It's to stir up a hunger in each one of us to be more than a group of people that meets here in this place that we call a church, and then go somewhere else the rest of the week and not live our lives as if we're on a mission from God, the mission that God has given to the church. And my challenge is that we all together make up a church wherever we are. If we're on the job, if we're in the classroom, if we're at the coffee shop, if we're reaching out to kids on a Wednesday night or families in our own neighborhoods, wherever we find ourselves, it's my challenge that we look for opportunities to actually engage in the activity of the church, because we as people are actually the church. This is just a building. We're the church. And so that's part of kind of breaking out of the mindset of what we think about when we talk about church. We need to be a community of people. We traced this all through the Bible last week. A community of people called out from among the nations to put on display the goodness and graciousness of God and His rule on the earth for the sake of the world. In other words, we're to be the people that God has taken out of the world and formed us to be like Himself, so that we could go back to that self-same world, that very same world, and put on display the goodness of God and what He's done in our lives, not for ourselves, but for the sake of the nations, for other people, so that they could come to know Christ. So that's so far outside of our thinking so often. I know in theory, maybe we could sort of believe that, but in practice, which is really a demonstration of what we believe, it doesn't happen. Therefore, I know we really don't believe it. We've relegated church to some time frame on some day to meet with some people, just to depart then at the end of that time and go about living our life as if we were never in church in the first place, or as if we are not indeed the church, which we are. We're called to be separate. We're called to be different. And so may we all grab hold of the vision of what God has called us to be that community that reaches out, to turn our world upside down. That's my prayer for our church and for all churches. Just like in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, verse 6. That's like the guiding verse for this whole study. And it says, when the believers, the church, came to Thessalonica, the whole town was upset, and they said, these men, they're the ones that everywhere they've gone, they have turned the world upside down, and now they have come here. And I said last week that term, turn the world upside down, could also be translated as they've caused trouble everywhere that they go, because they're turning every social structure, every pagan practice, every way to think about life. They're changing it. They're making it different. It's based on God's plan and not on man's plan. It's based on God's best and not on man's best. So there was a huge cultural war that was existing at the time, simply because the church stepped onto the scene empowered by God, and it seemed as if they were turning the world upside down, when in reality the world was upside down and they were in the process of turning it right side up. And that's what we want to be doing as the church. It's more than just here. It's there, we said. And that's how I want our focus to begin to shift. And so in order to do that, it's almost like you have to go back to the basics, like Church 101 or something, like Coach Wooden, the great basketball coach for UCLA. At the beginning of the season, he would always call his young team together and he would say, now, guys, this is how you put on your shoes and your socks. Not necessarily in that order, by the way. Or Coach Lombardi, right at the beginning of the season, he would take a football and he'd say, now, gentlemen, this is a football. Well, brothers and sisters, this is church. It's more than just this. It's so much more. And so that's what I want to talk about in this series. I'm not sure how long it's going to last. I'll do my best, though, to keep the sermons themselves short, and we'll just let this thing play out until we catch the vision, and it's burning more and more in my own heart as we come into the season where it's so much easier to get outside and to interact with our friends and our neighbors, both at home and in this very community as well. So, as we start our study today, I just want to give you a heads up. Turn to Matthew chapter 16. That's going to be our text today, beginning at verse 13. We'll read through 18 and then go on to 21 a little later. So I want to give you this heads up. This might be a little tough on our ears, might not be something like what we're used to hearing as far as a sermon goes, but what I'm going to endeavor to do, I'm just going to get out on a limb again here, like a crazy man, and I'm going to try to take the world of the Bible in some very small way that seems to be black and white and transform it into color. And I'm going to use it, I'm going to do that with the use of some pictures, at least to start out this sermon and to give you a backdrop as to what is happening here in Matthew chapter 16. I mean, just think, I can remember being a kid and having that little black and white TV on a little pop metal cart that you could roll around, and there were rabbit ears on the back, and if they broke off, you could put on that little circular antenna, or you could take some tin foil and stick them up there. And then we got this big, huge console color TV that the knobs broke off of. And you had to hit it on the corner to make the color come back because there was something special about that color. Somehow it made things come back to life. Now, we lost some things in black and white, like the use of shadow and all that kind of stuff that, people used to use when they made movies, but we gained so much more by seeing it in color. It's one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to, in just a few months from now, going to Israel, because to me, on that trip, things will go from black and white to color. So if you're still thinking about it, talk to me, and we can go change things from black and white to color. As for today, though, we simply have to settle for a few pictures as I give you a backdrop of this passage. And by the way, this is the first place where the word church is mentioned in the Bible. And it's done so by Jesus. So let's look at the backdrop and let's go to the location where all this happened. Verse 13a says this: when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, boring, right? Well, not so much if you understand a little bit about it. It sets everything up. And so let's go from black and white to color. See that? There's a little bit of a color map. Okay, now, looky here. I'm using a pointer, and can you guys see that on the screen? Okay, you can see it now. Most of Jesus' ministry happened right around there. That is the Sea of Galilee. All the way down here is Jerusalem, okay? Most of Jesus' ministry happened right here, or sometimes down in here. Sometimes he would travel through here. Well, at least one time we have a record of him going through here. This is Samaria, where good Jews should never go, to get down to Jerusalem and some of the surrounding towns. Sometimes he would, or at least one time, he went over here to Perea and went down to bypass Samaria. There were some political reasons for all of that. But essentially, all of his ministry happened right around the Sea of Galilee. And so when you look at Caesarea Philippi, it's right up here. And you say, what in the world Why would he go up there? There's no plausible reason why he would go up there. Now, this area right up here that became known as Caesarea Philippi is actually an ancient settlement that goes back to the Old Testament. It was called Baal Gad in the book of Joshua. And Baal, which is a god in the Old Testament, was worshipped there. And today it's called Benias or Peneus. And there's a reason why it's called Peneus today, and we'll get into that in just a minute. In the New Testament times, it was called Caesarea Philippi because that area, that region, right up there where it's located, okay, was given to Herod the Great as a gift from Augustus Caesar. After Herod the Great died, one of his sons inherited that region, and his name was Philip. And so he built that city up, and then what he did was, in an act of recognition for the gift given to his father, Augustus, he renamed that area Caesarea, and then he had to throw his own name in there, Philippi. This is Caesarea Philippi, right there. Now, there's another Caesarea over here, and that's called Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the sea. There's the Mediterranean Sea. So he could say, I named it Caesarea Philippi to distinguish it from the other Caesarea, but really he was just saying, hey Caesar, this is our town, you and me, we're just like this. So there was a lot of political wrangling that he did to do that. But in reality, this is a very interesting place for Jesus to take his disciples to. Now, as far as the geography goes of the whole land, this place is very, very important to the rest of what we would call the Holy Land there, because it sits at the mount of Mount Hermon. It sits at the foot of Mount Hermon. And what happens is in the wintertime, Mount Hermon gets snow on it, and the snow, then when it melts, seeps into the ground. And all around Mount Hermon, then what you have are these springs that pop up. And it's from these springs that the Jordan River, which runs right down through here, there's the Jordan River, and here's Caesarea Philippi. From those springs, this river is fed and it waters the land. So it's a very important place. Well, Caesarea Philippi has one of those springs. Wherever in the ancient world that you had a spring where you had water coming up from underground, what you had was a fertility cult that was established. So in the Old Testament, there was a fertility cult that was established in that region where they would worship Baal and Ashtoreth. If you've read the Old Testament, you're familiar with that fertility god and fertility goddess. Because the water would come up from the land, water the land, produce crops, so on and so forth, and give vitality to the land again. So there was a fertility cult, a worship of the fertility gods that took place there. Also, though, these springs were seen by the ancients as the passageway to Hades. The passageway in the Old Testament to Sheol. The watery place where the dead reside and the gods go to spend the winter. The fertility gods obviously would come out in the spring, right? At the end of all of the harvest season, they would go back in through that watery passage back into the underworld, there to spend the winter and then to come back out. It's like, seniors going down to Florida or something, I don't know, to spend the winter. They would go in and all through the winter they would go into Hades, and then they would come out again the next year. And so for many, many centuries, fertility gods were worshipped in that area. And then Alexander the Great comes along in about 330 BC. And he sees this area right here, and he says, that reminds me of my homeland. That reminds me, Alexander the Great was a great conqueror, and he took over that whole area. So he made it Greek. It's called Hellenization. He Hellenized that whole area. So when he comes through there, what he does is He says, this reminds me of my homeland and where we used to worship the god of fertility named Pan. Have you ever heard of Pan? The Greek god Pan? Never heard of the Greek god Pan. Well, today you're going to hear all about the Greek fertility god named Pan. Let's go to the next slide. Right there is Pan. Boy, he's a nice looking character, isn't he? He's the god of the mountainside, which works because there's Mount Hermon. He's the god of pastures because it's a rural setting. He's also the god of goats and sheep. He is the fertility god that's depicted as half man, half goat. He is this wild, shaggy creature that roams around in wilderness places, and he has a dark side. He spends much of his time chasing around the woods nymphs, beautiful females, to either terrorize and perhaps kill them or rape them. That's what he does. He is a very perverted individual. If he can catch them, that's what he'll do. Anyone traveling through this area where Jesus now takes his disciples would be alarmed as they came into this area, and they would move quietly out of superstition because it is said that Pan dwelt there. Because they didn't want to disturb him, they didn't want to make their presence known, because then he may come after them. Because if you weren't a worshiper of Pan, he would come to terrorize you. He may rape you. I told you it's going to be a little hard to handle, but this is the world that they lived in. This is where Jesus was taking his disciples. These 12 young guys, he's taking them up there. He may rape you, terrorize you, or kill you. And so you didn't want your presence to be known there because he might find you out. And in doing so, finding you out, he would induce, guess what? Panic. Yes, that's where the word comes from. Panic. He would create panic. You see how that carries down all the way to our culture today? And the panic would be due to either the arousal, if you were a worshiper, or the terror of destruction, your own destruction, if you weren't. And so you see this worship of this fertility god, Pan, was very perverted. They would hold a festival where fertility symbols would be worshipped, bowed down to. A 6-foot symbol would be carried around town or around that region of fertility, and people would literally bow down and worship all of that. Pan, let's go to the next slide, was a seducer, to say the least. Now what you have here is a picture of Pan seducing a nymph. And the story goes that one time he was chasing one of these nymphs, one of these beautiful young maidens that hung out in the woods. He was chasing her around, and in order to escape his grasp, she turned herself into a reed. And if you play a woodwind instrument, you know that reeds are essential to making the sound come out of, say for instance, a flute. This right here is a pan flute. And he would play that flute then to try to lure these nymphs out so that he could seduce them. All of this idea of fertility was based around this ungodly, immoral practice induced by this god in this region. His name was Pan. And it was essential that he did this because the ancients, in all of their superstition, which by the way, we still have them, all of this fertility activity would then set in motion all of the fertility for the land. The rains would come, they thought. The crops would sprout up and grow. Babies would be born. Baby lambs would be born. Baby goats would be born. Because if you are a Pan worshiper, guess what animal is very important to Pan worship? Remember, he's half man and half goat? You had to have goats to continue to worship Pan. And so goats are central to all of that worship. Now let's go and see what the disciples and Jesus saw when they came to that place, that city, Caesarea Philippi. Let's go to the shrines. Right here is a picture of what the disciples and Jesus would have seen when they went to that region, Caesarea Philippi. Right here, right here. Here we go. Don't do it to me now. Okay, when you look at all this, when they see all of this, the first thing that they would notice is this right here. You see that little dark spot right there? Can you see it? That's called the Grotto of Pan. That's where Pan would come in and out of the underworld. That's where the spring was. That's the Grotto of Pan. Right in front of the Grotto of Pan, right there, that is the temple of Augustus, because in that day, the emperor was also worshipped. So, here is the temple, and here is the grotto. Guess what that grotto was called? The gates of Hades. The gates of hell. That's where the gods came in and out of. Over here is the courtyard of Pan. A lot of activity would happen right over here as they would worship. Now, I don't know if you can see it or not, but right here is a little niche, and they would set up a symbol, a structure of Pan right there, so he could be worshipped. And all around that niche of Pan, for Pan would be other smaller niches where they might put other lesser gods or some of the nymphs. So they would have a visual as they came to this area and they worshiped right there in that area. Now, right next to that, there's the temple to Zeus, the king of the gods. And right here, they have two shrines of the goats. One for the living goats and one for the dead goats, because they buried their dead goats. They continued to worship goats in this area. So all of this right here was this huge center for pagan practice, the worship of all these gods that would come in and out of what they knew as the Grotto of Pan, or the gates of Hades. Hermes, it said, the Greek god, was Pan's father. He also resided there. Nemesis, the female fertility god, resided there. So this is like the most vile, ungodly place that Jesus could take his disciples. And what would happen is, when they would hold their festivals in this town, about 100,000 Pan worshipers would come. And they would begin their practice, and supposedly Pan would come out along with, this is going to be hard, okay, bear with me, but this is reality, along with goats that were in heat. And they would mate. That activity would carry over into human activity. And it would turn into this huge mass of humanity degrading themselves in every possible way. Now, have you ever heard of the work by Milton called Paradise Lost? Bear with me. Paradise Lost is built on a theology that after God created the heavens and the earth, and after Satan fell, he fell to this place along with a third of the angels that chose him and to follow him. They fell to some place, some people said the earth. This guy named John Milton in Paradise Lost comes up with a name for the place where all the demons went when they fell, along with Satan. And it's there that they plan on a way to get back at God, and they decide to go after the human beings, Adam and Eve, in the garden, and therefore that's why Satan appears in the garden, you see, to Eve to tempt her. So this whole plan of the fall of all mankind was hatched in this place where all the demons fell to. Guess what John Milton named that place? Pandemonium. Pandemonium. The place of lawlessness and ungodliness and confusion where all of the demons fell and now reside. Knowing his history and understanding the pull of mythology, he names the place of the demons Pandemonium. Now, Jesus' disciples didn't know that, but it's a good description that every Jewish boy would know. Don't go there. It's not a good place. It's like turning a bunch of young men loose in Las Vegas, except 10 times worse. And here we have the Messiah, the Son of God, taking his disciples right there. It's like, Jesus, couldn't you take them on a missions trip someplace nice? Couldn't you do that here? No, I have to take them there because I need to teach them something. But in order to do that, I have to take them to the most vile place on earth. Right here, to the gates of hell. Let's go to the next slide. This is the courtyard of Pan that I was talking about, where all that worship happened. Right here, they would put an image of Pan. And then right here, in these other niches, they would put the other gods or representations of these nymphs. All that was to stimulate worship. It was to give them a visual. Now, it was very grand in the day. As I said, during the festival, 100,000 people would be there. This is what it looks like today. This is Caesarea Philippi today. Doesn't look very impressive, does it? But guess what's right there? There it is, the gate of hell. It's collapsed a little bit because an earthquake in the 1800s happened there. And it actually also displaced the spring, and now the water comes out down here instead of up here. And if you look closely right next to it, you can see the niche of Pan. That place still exists right there, but it's not very impressive today. And so you say, oh my goodness, Joe, why did you go through all of that? Just to get us to this place. Matthew 16:13. When Jesus went to that region, go back to the map, Craig. Or Samuel, sorry about that. Go back to the map, next picture. Why did Jesus go there? I mean, obviously, all of his ministry took place here. Why did he have to go up there? Why did he go up there? It was very strategic in Jesus' mind, and it was a turning point in his ministry. He had to take his disciples there because after this time, Jesus begins to announce, if you continue to read in the book of Matthew, he begins to announce the fact that he's going to have to go to Jerusalem and to be crucified. So he takes his disciples to the most vile place on earth just before he says, listen, I'm getting ready to go and suffer and die. There had to be a reason why he took them there. I mean, the rabbis said that, listen, the gates of Hades could not exist in a world where the Messiah was present. He would close the gates of Hades down if he came. That's what the rabbis said. Jesus came to teach his disciples that I'm here and I'm coming to close the gates of heaven down, and I'm going to use the church, flesh and blood, a group of people called out from among the nations, formed around their God, to be blessed by their God, to put on display his goodness, his graciousness for the sake of the nations, even in the most vile place on the face of the earth. I have to go there to show you what you're going to be up against and to help you to understand, to know. You see, this was a faith lesson. To know that with my power, it can be done. My church will do this. So the whole reason that Jesus takes them up there was to give them this faith lesson. Let's read on. 13b. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, verse 14, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Those are the rumors that are flying around. Verse 15, Jesus brings it home. But what do you say? He asked. What about you? Who do you say that I am? This is the whole reason why he brought the 12 young guys up there. To give them this faith lesson concerning the church. Verse 16, Simon Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Go to the next picture. This whole area that we've just looked at, guess what that's called? The rock of the gods. That's called the rock of the gods. And so Peter's answer to Jesus' question, "Who do you say I am?" With Peter's answer, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," stands in stark opposition to this, the rock of the gods that are dead, that are no gods at all. You, Jesus, are the Son of the living God, as opposed to all of this. And so these bunch of young guys have to go to this place that's like Las Vegas times 10, so that Jesus can teach them a lesson over against the world system, over against every mythology, over against every other belief that could be conjured up in the heart of vile and wicked men. Jesus is the way. He is the true and living God. He is the Son of the living God, as opposed to those that are dead. He was teaching them to trust Him even in the darkest places that they may be called to go. And believe me, the disciples would be called to go to some very dark and desperate and hostile places. Remember, there they are standing in a place that you did not want the God of that region to know that you were there. You did not want to cause a disturbance. And Jesus takes these young guys right up there. And He says, "Who do men say that I am? I'm not like one of these. I'm the Son of the living God." And then He follows all of this up with a promise, verse 17. And Jesus replied after Peter's answer, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." You didn't make this up. This came from God. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." On this rock. On this rock. Think of the visual. On this rock. Now, Catholics say that the rock is Peter. And in part, rightly so, because other places in the New Testament say that the church is built on the apostles and prophets. And Peter, the disciple, became an apostle. A disciple is a learner, an apostle is a sent one. It's the same group. They just changed job descriptions. So in a sense, yes, the church is built on Peter. Protestants say it's not on Peter himself, it's on his profession of who Christ is. And sure, certainly, that's all over the New Testament. That came from God. That was a revelation of the Holy Spirit that gives birth to something bigger, the newness of a kingdom that's going to come, of which I am the king, Jesus is saying. So that's valid as well. Catholics say it's Peter. Well, the church is built on the apostles. Protestants, they say that's Christ and Peter's confession concerning Christ. But is it just possible? I mean, think about it for a minute. Jesus took them there. Is it possible that when He said upon this rock, He was talking about that rock, that they would have known as the rock of the gods? Is it possible that He used this as a word picture? And you say, are you just making this up? Absolutely not. Because look what He says next. "And the gates of hell will not prevail against it." What's that called? The Grotto of Pan. The gates of hell. They're looking at what in their world was known as the gates of hell when Jesus said these words. And so what is the significance of all of this? And that is this. In the most pagan place that Jesus could take them, you 12 You small group of young, ragtag roughnecks are going to conquer all this in my name. Who would believe it? For centuries, for generations, this had been a place of pagan worship, dating all the way back to Old Testament times. It was permanent. And Jesus is saying, hey, young guys, you're going to change all this. Well, let me say something. If he told old guys that, they wouldn't believe him. Young guys will believe anything because they think they can do anything. Jesus was smart. He knew who to take up there. As dangerous as it was, you young guys, you're going to change this. As vile as it is, this is a faith lesson. Empowered by me, you will indeed change the world. So what Jesus is saying to them, maybe in their ears, is this. You're not going back to your comfortable little home, in your little fishing village, in your little enclave where everything is okay and you know everybody and you're safe every day and every night. No, you're going to this place, and that's where I'm going to build my church. You're going to the world with all of its vile attractions and everything that it entails, and you're going to stand for me. You're going to trust me, because if you trust yourself, you'll fall prey to it. Think of the lewd and lascivious behavior that was happening there. Don't think about it for too long. Think about it. And Jesus is saying, you're going to go and you're going to change all of this. And it's not going to be comfortable. You're going to go to the very gates. I mean, gates are something that's defensive, right? It's to keep people out. Nobody says, hey, grab the gates, let's go attack the enemy. No, they're defensive. Jesus is saying you're going to go there and you're going to plunder the kingdom of the strong man, which is a metaphor for Satan. You're going to go right into the devil's territory and you're going to emerge victorious with the message of the gospel. You will plunder the kingdom of the strong man. You bunch of young guys, ragtag as you are, you ruffians, you rednecks, although they're from the north. That's where they were all from except for one. Judas, by the way, was from the south. You are going to be my community of people called out from among the nations to put on display the goodness and graciousness of God's rule for the sake of the world, even in the most dark place, wherever it is that I send you, wherever it is that you find yourself, you are going to turn that world upside down. And so today, Caesarea Philippi is just a tourist trap. It's just a heap of rubble. But you and I, and around this town, and the next town, and the city, and all over the world today, you and I, we're the church, and we're here. That's gone. We're here. What Jesus said was true. It was true because he said it and he was God. But there's an interesting thing here. Remember last week I said God was going to do all this and he's going to do it through flesh and blood. God is going to build his kingdom through people. We are people created in his image to take his message to the world, no matter how dark it is. Now, let's say all this is true. Let's say everything that we've talked about is true. Gates of hell, this dark place, this faith lesson that Jesus takes his disciples up here to demonstrate. All about all of that. What are the implications? What are we supposed to do here? Well, isn't church supposed to be like a refuge? Of course it is. But it's more than just a refuge. It's also a staging area. It's where we come to be healed so that we can go out there and heal. You see? It's where we come to teach so that we can go out there and teach. It's where we come here. Here is where we come to be discipled so that we can go out there, so that we can go, the picture's down, but that's okay, so that we can go out there. You get the image by now. So we can go out there and we can disciple. We come here to worship so that every day outside these walls we can live a life of worship that is glorifying to God so that the nations will see the goodness and the graciousness of God's rule and perhaps turn their hearts towards Him. That is the function of the church. That is the implication of all of this. We're not supposed to come here just to get the warm and fuzzies, okay? That's not what it's all about. That's not the image that Jesus is giving here. The image that Jesus is giving here is go to your pagan world, wherever it is, and be a light that shines in the darkness and tell people with words and with your life about my kingdom that will set them free from all of this activity, with all of these things that hold people in bondage and in fear, in panic, you see, of what might happen next. People who live their lives thinking that they're autonomous and they rule and they reign and they can do whatever they want in the world. I'll tell you, I guarantee, at night, they're in a panic because their world is in pandemonium. Oh, they'd never let you know it. And hey, there's pleasure in sin for a while, right? That's what the Bible says. But in the end, it turns out to be nothing more than self-destruction, behavior that leads to that, and turmoil, and a lack of satisfaction because they're violating every one of God's moral laws. Jesus said that's the kind of place that you have to go to. I'm not advocating that you go down to the local bar. I'm saying you go to your neighborhood. You go to your world. You go to where God says you go. And right there where you find yourself, that's where you're a light. That's when you're the church. So the focus is not so much here. The focus of the church is out there. You see, not many people are singing songs to Pan today, although some are, by the way. But today, many more people are singing songs to Jesus because He built His church like He said He was. Jesus did not build a building. He started a revolutionary movement called the church to turn the world upside down, and He used people just like you and I to do that. And so what are our weapons? Verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and to suffer many things, and that He might be killed, and on the third day be raised again to life. So how will this place be conquered? It's not going to be by political activism. It's not going to be by clever bumper stickers or witness wear. It's not going to be by doing a bunch of good works. It's going to be done through perseverance, even when we ourselves, for His sake, suffer or are under the threat of death. We're going to do it in the power of His resurrection. This is how it's all going to happen. And how does that power of the resurrection play out in our lives, that power that has transformed us? Number one, through sacrificial love. Considering others, preferring others without consideration for ourselves. We simply love with no strings attached. Through faith, through prayer, through goodness, through kindness, grace, truth, mercy. Get this, through baptism. Yeah, that's right, through baptism. You know what baptism is supposed to be? A testimony to an unbelieving world. Why do you think they used to go down to the river? You are bearing witness when your life, when you step down into that water, to say that I'm going to entrust my life to someone else. The weight of who I am is trusted to the strength of someone else. I'm going to die to myself as I go under the water. And that same strength that helped me to go under water will also, in that power, raise me up to newness of life. So what you're saying in baptism is, to the world, oh, we celebrate it in the church, but to the world, the bigger picture is this. The power of Jesus' resurrection has changed my life and has given me deliverance over all this stuff. And now I stand here and bear witness to that. What an effective tool. What an effective weapon that we've lost. Another weapon is the Lord's Supper, communion, where we examine ourselves, where we remember what Jesus has done and that He's coming back, and we order our lives in that way so that when we walk out of this place, communion can be a time of change so that we become the change agents in the world that do indeed bring the kind of change that God wants to convert people from the darkness of pagan culture into the light of His Son. The problem is, nobody really believes this. Otherwise, they would act on it. Instead, we, with the rest of culture, we respond in fear. We watch the news, and we say, oh my goodness, there's terrorism all around. Oh my goodness, Bruce Jenner has now changed his name. I got news for you, he's still Bruce Jenner. You can change the parts, but it doesn't make a difference. You're perverting what is sacred. We operate in fear. What about what's happened in Baltimore? You can watch the news, I don't care what channel it is, until you go crazy with panic and fear, thinking that the whole world is going to close in on you. But what if a group of 11 or 12 of us decided that the kingdom works based on the principles that Jesus set forth, knowing that the gates of hell would not prevail against it? What if we went forth from this place with that attitude, really believing it and acting upon what we say we believe? And at that point, guess what? It wouldn't matter what Caesar was in control. It wouldn't matter what president was in office. It wouldn't matter what the Supreme Court said about the nature of the family, because we have the gospel message in the face of all of that. Should we engage in political activity? If that's your calling, absolutely. But can you put your hope in politics? Not even remotely. Should you engage in civic activity in your community? Absolutely. On school boards, on city council, whatever you're called to, absolutely. But will that change a person's heart because they see you doing that? Absolutely not. Because our hope is not in what we do. Our hope is in what we believe and then acting upon it. So what if we acted like that early church and we simply went wherever God told us to go? To be a people that was called out from the nations, to be formed around the mandate of their God, to take that change in our lives to the nations, to put God on display and His goodness and His graciousness for their sake, not wanting anything in return. You see, we think we go out there so we can get people to come to our church. No, that's a byproduct so that they can come back to the staging area, so that they can go back out. And if they choose to go to another church, praise God, because the church is not this building. It's all of us and everybody else that's part of the church. We're just operating under the mandate of the kingdom, whose king is Jesus Christ. And if we say what we believe, we will go to the darkest places. And when we see that as our mission field, when we leave this place, that's our mission field, to go out and to carry the gospel. So we need to repent from being afraid like everybody else, from being in a panic about what's going on in the world around us. You see, the culture war that the church has been fighting is the wrong war. The things that we war against are spiritual, not some political ideology. We war for control of man's heart, so that they might be changed, as dark as it may be. Because listen, how dark is your heart? And you say you've been changed. There's still areas of darkness where you haven't let Jesus in, and I haven't let Jesus in. We all struggle with that. How dark is the heart that doesn't know Jesus? They don't want to admit it. They just go through the motions of pan worship, and they think that's what brings fertility, that's what brings life. When in reality, that brings death. You're trusting in a myth. You're trusting in yourself. And so what the church has become, I don't think that's what Jesus died and rose again for. So that we could come in here and we could rate this like we do a movie, whether we liked it or not. Whether the preaching was good or the song service was good. And if we like it, we tip, and if we don't like it, we don't tip. And we leave this place and we're not changed. Or do we argue about minor points in the Scripture that in the end don't mean anything to a world that so desperately needs Jesus? Do we expend all of our energy inwardly taking care of our own? Yes, this place should be a refuge, but it's also a staging area so that we're just not consumers, but the church has become just another place where there's a list of consumer items that you can, give or take. Good preaching, good singing in a minor key to elicit some kind of emotional response, and then boom, we sing another song, we close in prayer, and then we walk out of here and we're no different. I don't think that's what Jesus died for. I don't think if we read the book of Acts, we could say, oh yeah, that's our church. That's what's happening right there, because those same guys that Jesus took up there, they went back to Jerusalem and they waited for the power of God to come upon them. And then they went and they turned their world upside down. And so today, church, this is how you put your shoes and socks on. And this is a football. Jesus is looking for hearts that are fully open to go into the darkest places of their world and to make a difference for the kingdom, for Him. That's the church. So consider this community that we call Centerbrook. Should we not be a people on display for God, for the sake of the nations? Should we not take what happens here out there? I think we should, because this, as I close, is only a staging area where we come to encourage one another, to take note of what God is saying to us, to spur one another on to good deeds. So much so that this place becomes not the focus, but the reminder of what we're supposed to do. Do you see how we have it backwards? Coming together seems to be our focus. That was never Jesus' intent. When that early church in the book of Acts came together, they would have stayed in Jerusalem, except persecution drove them out, because that's God's plan, to take the message of God's Son and His kingdom to the dark places all around us. And we know they're there. And to not be contaminated, by the way, by what's around us, but to stand strong for God. That's our challenge, to be that community of people that are called out. We're different from everybody else. There's something inside of us that compels us to do God's work for the sake of other people. Will we do that? And if we will, I would submit to you that, like the church in the book of Acts, the very reason we're here today, this church and other churches, if we would all do the same, would continue to be unstoppable. Because that's what it's all about. This is not the focus. This is the staging area. This is the place where we come to be reminded what our mission is. To go out and be the church that's unstoppable. Would you agree with me on that point today? And so often we get it backwards. I was on my way here this morning, and I was reminded in a very graphic way how the church really has forgotten it. And we can point our fingers all day long. We do the same thing except in a different way, I guarantee it. As I was driving up one of the roads on my way here, I passed a church festival where even perhaps by now they're drinking and gambling, and young ladies are wearing short shorts and low-cut tops, and young guys' eyes are bulging out of their heads in lust, all on church property. How far has the church come? We miss the point of the calling. Now that's just one example. we do it. We do the same thing, just in different ways, by making this the focus. And I'm just as guilty as everyone else. Because I'll tell you, I'd like to see this place filled up. And sometimes I think it's for selfish reasons. So God is really dealing with my heart on all of this. So it's a passion that's developing more and more with me that there's no way I can convey the full extent of it except to use words and graphic pictures like this to make what's been black and white in me become color inside. The church is so much more than this, guys. So much more than this. It can be so much more than this. It's a staging area where we go out and do the work of the kingdom for the sake of other people. Can we change? Can our hearts change? Stand with me if you would. Maybe a better question is this: Will we change? Will we allow our focus to be changed? Will we begin to speak to people about Jesus that we never have before? Will we allow our lives to be a witness like never before? One of the greatest blessings in my whole life, I know this sounds crazy as I close. One of the greatest blessings in my whole life was to be at my father's viewing. I mean, obviously I grew up with my dad. He was only a couple years older than me. He always told everybody that I was his younger brother, which people believed it because we weren't that far apart in age. I go to my father, this rough, tough, but friendly and teddy bear of a guy in reality, who knew everybody and engaged everybody, only to hear them say, over and over, hundreds of people, hundreds, say, all your dad did was talk about church. You know, he started here when we started and missed 2 times in the 15 months that he came here. 2 times. That was not like him. I trust that God made a difference. And he couldn't, crazy even to me now, he couldn't be quiet about it. And all those people told me that. I didn't make that up. I didn't wish that. I didn't hope that. They told me that all he did when he met them was talk about church. He was sharing the message in his way. It made a difference. To my father, this was a staging area, and he didn't even know it. We know it, so how much more should we view it in the same way? Let's pray. Lord, this was hard, this was basic, this was graphic, but this was reality, God. The reality that's bubbling up in my heart to say that there's more than this about church. It's not about us. It's about you, and it's about your kingdom, and building your kingdom, and being part of that. It's about going to our world and to not be so influenced by the world that we travel and move in, that our witness is destroyed. But God, it's about being different so that people would find you attractive. So that what you've done in us would bubble over into our speech, and we would actually begin to live and act what we say we believe. Even when it may not be popular, even when it might be in some way frightening to us. Lord, I pray that we would indeed be your witnesses to all the nations, being empowered by your Spirit to be a community of believers called out from among the nations to be formed around you, our God, to show your goodness and graciousness for the sake of the nations, even if it means that we have to go to Caesarea Philippi to do so. God, I pray today that your Spirit would have sparked something in our hearts, that we would begin to change the way we look at church and our role. May we be empowered and challenged to do your work and become literally the unstoppable church. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.